Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our automation and AI breakout sessions. We have a fireside chat here this morning. I am Elena Patillo. I'm with Plug and Play in Bentonville. We have a headquarters in Silicon Valley also. We have John Irvin, Chief Data Officer, Information Technology Services at Deloitte, with Woody Evans, Vice President, Global Presales at Delphix. Enjoy our session this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Woody Evans, VP for Global Solutions, and I'm joined by John Irvin, our CDO. And I'd like to focus our conversation today on AI, data automation, and DevOps, explore some of the experiences you've had, elicit some of your insights, and draw something out of that some folks here can use. So first, I think our clicker is not working here. All right. Well, three themes have dominated the discussion that we've had with software engineering leaders in the last few months. One is the challenge that an opportunity that AI brings to reducing the cost of error. The next is how AI will impact a developer's cognitive load. And third, how AI will change the need and importance of context switch. I'm still not getting a...
Technology, right?
We'll get it on the screen in a second. All right, well, on the subject of cost of error.
Speaking of which.
In the case of mass data is fictitious but realistic data, and that cost of error can show up as breaches or data leaks. I think we talked about that. And increasingly, there's a threat with Gen AI that inaccurate information can get out there, that it can be leaked out. So I know Deloitte has been developing an in-house large language model, but as you scale up, what sort of problems do you see and do you think get magnified from the perspective of training that model, as well as automating or removing humans from the process of gathering content?
Yeah, well, thanks, Woody. Thanks for the invitation. We have had a long, great partnership with Delphix. So first, before I dive right into the specifics of the question of Gen AI and the trust aspect of it, for context, my name is John Irvin. I am with Deloitte. I'm not a professional services consultant. We got plenty of folks that will sell all of you in the audience, but that's not my role. My role is internal within the Deloitte firm. My job is to enable our professionals with capabilities that'll help us operate the U.S. firm more effectively. And like you said, when we started with Delphix, our cost of error that we were trying to avoid was around breaches and leaks, focused very heavily on my responsibility to develop an enterprise data anonymization capability. And when I say capability, just for context for our conversation today, I think of capabilities in three dimensions. I think of them as standardized methodologies that can be repeated over and over again to produce consistent quality outcomes. People that are skilled in those methodologies, and tech to enable them. And we think of tech, or at least in my space, we invest in tech. We think more where we can buy versus build. Buy when it's not necessarily a significant differentiator for us. So anyway, with that context set, we're thinking of it the same thing with generative AI, right? Our foundation with our customers is built on trust. We take that very seriously. When it comes to the data and the methodology part of the Gen AI capabilities, we're thinking very strategically about the different types of data we can use for the different types of use cases. What data can be anonymized? Can I use maybe synthetic data? Can I not use synthetic data? So we've developed some pretty robust frameworks to use internally. And because we can't, right? We can't have cases where data that we maybe think we've anonymized is used for training, makes it into a model that we fine-tuned, that ultimately gets used and produces a result that's not going to be good for us or obviously our customers as well. So that's kind of how it ties together as we're thinking more even about Gen AI.
Great. On the subject of cognitive load, so tools like GitHub Copilot or ChatGPT-4, we're seeing a bit of a paradox where maybe the temporary relief on the strain on the developer or tester will in the future actually result in a higher level of strain. I'd love to hear your comments on that idea and that sort of paradox.
Yeah. I think there's lots of paradoxes. I don't know about you guys. I mean, I'm an early adopter of GPT and the models and the concept. I think it's increasing my context shifting, which increases the cognitive load. I'm able to do things better, faster. It has me moving on to the next thing faster. And I think that's gonna, so I think there is a paradox. I think we're gonna see that a load actually increase on our folks. I think another, with generative AI though, we're also seeing, or at least we can envision, our engineers, right, who maybe spend significant amount of time coding, they maybe not be doing that as much, and they may be needing to elevate into different types of responsibilities, maybe more design work, maybe more architecture, using muscles maybe that they haven't had to use before.
So you think maybe we need to have a whole room full of architects instead of developers in the future?
I'm not sure how that's going to play out. I think there's just so much. We're learning, just like Tim said, what we say right now, we might look back a month from now or a year from now and say, these guys didn't know what the heck they were talking about. I think I have a 19-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter. I'm even kind of more interested in the long-term implications of generative AI. My daughter, who's a sophomore in college right now, has her GPT account. She uses it quite a bit. Can't help but wonder, what muscles is she not using, right? And are those going to atrophy in a way? And what are the long-term implications of that? But I think it's definitely a paradox, and I definitely believe it's going to increase loads.
Interesting. Well, sticking with that subject of context switch, in many ways, DevOps tooling has been a boon for code, right? Because automation is really helpful. But data automation is more of a new frontier, and data is still at the root of much of the context switch costs for those people that develop our applications. So as AI has been a force multiplying effect, that context switch becomes more important than ever. What do you see as the most important capabilities and developments in data automation that can handle that expected radical increase in context switching that AI will enable for us at scale?
Yeah, I think this plays right into the heart, Woody, of where we invested in with Delphix technology originally. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of applications that we've developed within Deloitte to operate our firm. And for our engineers and for our quality engineers, one of the things that would most often take them out of the flow of focusing on either building their solutions or testing their solutions was figuring, how do I get access to relevant data, right, to help me develop my solution. And they would often then have to get out of their flow, right, context switch into what are the business processes I need to use to go actually request access to potentially production data? What do I need to then do to run through our procedures for anonymizing that, et cetera? And so it consistently took them out of the flow. So that, just for us, again, for the context, is that today it's as seamless as folks, be they engineers or quality engineers, saying, I want that data, click a button, and I've got it. And there's no disruption in the flow.
Great. Well, data masking is notoriously difficult to scale, and especially across lots of heterogeneous environments in many clouds. And as the demand for both synchronicity and referential consistency grows, it can be daunting at scale.
Yes,
so what do you see as the essential capability of Deloitte's enterprise anonymization strategy? And what approach are you using from both a strategy and a tools perspective to achieve that scale?
Great question. And yes, it is very, very, very difficult. I can attest to that, and anybody here who's actively working trying to manage enterprise data at scale would agree. First, on a strategy perspective, besides looking at it through the three lenses I mentioned earlier of what are the methodologies, the people aspect of it, and the technology, the biggest kind of strategy lens I would recommend or guide on is figuring out for your organization what you're going to centralize and what you're gonna federate. And that will look different for every organization, depending on the organizational needs, the organizational structure. For us, it was critical strategically that we centralized our methodologies, a one-way approach for doing data anonymization capabilities. It was critical for us to get scale to centralize the platform operations, the administration, but we've chose to federate the end mile as much as possible. With our platform capability, we offer folks, our developers across the organization, they can either use our full service capabilities to get them onboarded, work through setting up their particular data sets to be anonymized, for example, or we allow them, if it's their preference, to bring your own engineer. I don't have a lot of folks that take me up on the bring your own engineer, but
right.
we offer that. So strategically thinking through that, what do I centralize, what do I federate? And kind of in the Zebra presentation, we're a strong believer in get the product and service as close to the consumer of where they're gonna be touching as possible. I just do it internally.
I totally agree. It's getting the data that they need to that person as soon as possible.
To the data, the data is the output, but even the how do I start the process and everything else like that. So that's the strategy lens. Wow, tactically I could go on kind of really quickly. Synchronization of the data was a big one, as you can imagine. Even a standalone application that has its own transactional data, it needs to consume master data, right? Our employee data, our customer data. For us, we don't sell products like a lot of the retail companies here. I sell engagements, the engagements. So synchronization of the data sets, timing of when data snapshots were taking place is critical. Referential integrity for those that aren't in the data world. If I'm going to anonymize or pseudo-anonymize John Irvin and I'm going to become, whatever, Jane Doe, I should do that consistently. My personnel number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if we're going to change that, right, I better do it consistently. So as my transaction calls out to other systems, there's consistency there. So those are some of the things. I think scalability, for us, we're not a Walmart. I don't have the volume of data, but I'm pretty sure I have the complexity of data in terms of cloud providers. We have a hybrid cloud strategy. And finally, I guess the last capability, this is a differentiator for Delphix, is the virtualization capability, right? The ability to virtualize these data where basically, when I need another copy of a database, for example, it's not using a full-size data, not taking up the exact, duplicating the amount of the size of the data. And it's also giving what's very unique. It gives our engineers and our quality engineers the ability to kind of time travel with data. They to any point in time. It's not saying, go get me a backup from yesterday or last week. They can basically, if we had a production issue, for example, with the virtualization capability, could say, I'm gonna take the database right back to the point previous to a point of failure and see what data look like, right to maybe after a point of failure, and that's through the virtualization capability. That's a differentiator. In my complex environment, Delphix isn't the only, Delphix isn't the only masking solution I have. It's not uncommon. There's lots of capabilities where just the complexities of our environment might require this. We consider that other product a plan B. In the rare cases where I'm not able to use Delphix, basically, I have customers basically coming to me and say, why can't I, and when am I going to be able to use Delphix here?
That's great. I know I was speaking to a CISO a couple of months back about the whole idea that it's not just data that has this left shift, but when you add the complexity of masking on top of that, you need to marry them together in order to avoid that really powerful shift right that can happen, because when you mask your data, you get the same kind of effect as if your data is all jumbled up, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, great. Well, one of the great conversation points that we talked about was what I would call the cloud of false beliefs. And when it comes to data protection, we're at the conjunction of many of these. And I passed this by a couple of other folks in the field that are reasonably expert in it. And one of the biggest false beliefs is that synthetic data provides some sort of absolute protection against attack. What is your take on that?
I don't know that any solution provides absolute protection, to be quite honest with you, including synthetic. I think there is a place for synthetic data generation capabilities for sure. There's this trade-off, what you'll find in this space, trade-off between utility, right, of the data and the risk, kind of the protection, right? The greater you focus on masking or de-identification of data, and the more identifiers, or what they call quasi-identifiers, you de-identify, maybe the more secure it is, but the utility just goes down dramatically. A couple of years ago, I did a session at the Nashville Analytics Summit conference, similar to this one, the Nashville Technology Community, and it was on scaling a data anonymization capability, what we're talking about here. And I opened that session with a fantastic story. You can Google it out there, but it plays this out, explains it very well. In Massachusetts, several years ago, one of the insurance organizations, I think it was called the Massachusetts Insurance Corporation or something like that, decided to release de-identified health data for research purposes, and they made it publicly available. Now they removed every PII identifier.
Each of the 18 fields for
HIPAA. Everything. And so you're like, okay, what's the risk of that? And I remember even the governor kind of touted it as like, this is great, right? This shows us being forward thinking. Well, there was a researcher, LaTanya Sweeney, I think. Sweeney is her name, and she was very focused. She's become a pretty famous researcher on privacy and kind of advanced capabilities there. But she was able to very quickly, by going and getting voter registration data, she purchased, I don't know, $100 or something like that, voter registration data, and was able to re-identify several of the health records for them. Coincidentally, one of them was the actual governor himself, and they knew that because he had a medical issue, went to the hospital one day. That was public news. But basically, because they had in the original data set a zip code of the individual, their birth date, and their sex, she was able to join that through the voter registration and got names and that. And actually, there's studies have been since been done with actually just those three attributes. We can identify about 60% of the population in the United States just with your zip code, your birth date, and your sex.
Very effective.
It's like that kind of stuff to me is like made me think, and that's like originally when we were thinking, well, we were doing data anonymization because we told people if you take production data, you need to anonymize it, anonymize the PII. That there's a lot more to this that folks
it's a real science.
It's a science to it, and it is a science. It is a science. You need to know what you're doing, and if you haven't thought about that, then what you're probably doing is checking a box. And we're not in the business. I'm not in the business of checking the box when it comes to sensitive data.
Well, a corollary and maybe another false belief that I think we talked about was that protection measures like de-identification, right? They give your data some utility, but that utility is not the same for different use cases. For example, for analytics versus, say, code development. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And with Gen AI, we're saying it's the same it's the same thing. And so as a real example, if I have a data set and I've choose to, basically remove my, we say this high risk data, and I choose to remove very specific identifiers of people, right? A person. Well, I've in effect made that resulting data set useless for testing of the application, right? I can't do that. It might work fine for certain types of AI or ML use cases for training, but for testing an application, no way. So we're starting to see, and this is coming up in our Gen AI conversations, I can take the exact same source data, but I need to apply different rules potentially to it based on the very specific use case. A real example was when we do work with clients, sometimes the deliverables we put to clients, we store in a knowledge repository that becomes available for other professionals in the organization to use. Right. As you can imagine, Woody, a very high threshold on redaction of any information that could tie to a specific client or an engagement, right? Very high, so very high level of that. And so that can work for some use cases. We were looking at building a model, or actually are doing this, a Gen AI model, where unfortunately taking out the client name isn't going to help us, because what we need in that data set, while we don't want the client's name, we do want industry information and other attributes, because again, that's what will help kind of produce a more effective large language model that we can leverage. Again, so we don't want the client showing up on the input, but oh, by the way, we want is the industries and sectors, for example. So different use, same data, different use cases.
So a lot of this, for example, I've seen where people doing analytics will bucket information, right? Where they might roll it up to the first 3 of the zip code or the first 2, or they'll bucket together, age groups, and instead of having all the individual ages, they'll push them all together. But that, of course, causes anyone who's actually doing feature delivery to crap the bed, right?
Correct.
It fails completely.
That's back to that risk. That's back to that utility versus, right, the risk.
So for AI, the utility is more in the group characteristics kind of column, versus development, it's more in the integrity kind of column, where you have to have that in order to make a test work. And that means that there's different ways of approaching this problem, yes?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's the back to there is a science to it. It's back to there is the use case. That's back to I'm taking exact same data set and I'm needing to think about provisioning it, right, as with anonymization differently based on different use cases.
Great. All right, and I apologize for the eye chart here. But for anyone who's a DevOps practitioner, John, one of the insights of DevOps is that smaller batch sizes and more frequent releases leads to an overall increase in quality and reduction of error. For example, we've seen that when data sets themselves are versioned, the rework rate on code falls dramatically. In comparing organizations who version data sets less than 1 week versus those that do it daily, that drop can be 8%, even for really mature shops. So as you advise projects, what's your experience on the value that emerges when data is automated at scale?
Yeah, well, I think the automation, right, is key. That's why I think even the concept of, we call it data ops. I mean, we have a data ops capability. We think of this as a key component of that. I think first and foremost, the automation is key, right? It's key to us. The ability for our engineers and our quality engineers to get very specific and narrow, to your point, it's kind of concept of smaller batches, being able to hone in on specific areas or life cycles of the data is another critical capability as well.
So some Google scientists have postulated that machine learning technical debt is just as pervasive as regular technical debt. And as many of us know, having used some of these models, training on bad data can lead to bias or poor incorrect decisions or wrong answers or whatever. So one feature of continuous data is the capability to keep large, heterogeneous collections of data fresh and synchronized. We keep hearing that data is the new oil, but more and more it feels like that we need a corollary to recovery time for when AI goes a little bit rogue. So what's your view on the idea that recovery time for training data, and how do you see that kind of velocity and scale that continuous data provides affecting that, fitting into that?
Yeah, recovery, what was it? Recovery
time for training data. I know it was a mouthful when we talked about it before, too.
I joke with Woody, I think I put this on LinkedIn about this session, is every time we talk, it's like I learned something new, or you throw something at me. It's like, okay, I got to think about that one. But no, it's a good question. I think as we've matured our AI ML capabilities within my team, and to be fair, my team is focused more as an enabler. I run, for example, our data science platform that professionals within our data science teams in Deloitte, which don't report to me directly, they're in the businesses, leverage. We have had to focus much more on what we call ML ops, right? We got lots of ops, right? Data ops, DevOps, ML ops, and that's the idea of managing the life cycle of machine learning from beginning to end. So why am I going there? It's because addressing things like bias, addressing things like ML drift or model drift,
Right.
which Tim this morning in the SAM, right? He talked about, was it like producing fresh, how many of certain recipes to produce on a given day, and they didn't think about seasonality, right? So that whole life cycle, we've put an awful lot of focus on trying to prevent AI from going rogue. I like to consider that maybe that's the belts, that's our belt, right? We're going to do all we can to prevent that. But what we're talking here maybe is the suspenders portion of this.
That's right.
It's kind of like potentially data breaches. It's not a if, it's a when.
It's a win.
So I think what we're talking about here is I haven't had this case come up, right, where I've needed to all of a sudden, it's like, I kind of urgently go look at data for retraining, right? But the capabilities we've talked about to be able to manage your data at scale and as agile as we've been talking about and we've been able to do with test data management for applications, it applies in my mind exactly the same way. So I kind of think of this as that, belts and suspenders approach. But I am going to try to do all I can to not have to use the capability for rogue, to retrain rogue AI.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you, John, for having this little fireside chat with me today. It was very illuminating, and I think lots of different new avenues that folks haven't explored before. And if any of our folks here would like to know anything more about Delphix, feel free to scan our QR code.